They had 72 hours of water left. The goats were dying. The crops were ash-colored sticks in cracked earth. And the man who'd staked everything on this red rock wilderness was standing at the edge of his dry well, staring into nothing, when his wife came up behind him and said the one thing he didn't want to hear. "We have to talk about leaving." But they didn't leave. Because that same afternoon, a half-dead goat limped through the brush and disappeared into a crack in the sandstone cliff. And from somewhere inside that darkness came something impossible, something cold, something wet. If you're watching this story from wherever you are in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this journey travels. Hit that like button and follow along, because what Caleb and Elena Ashford found inside that desert cliff didn't just save their homestead, it changed the fate of an entire valley. The summer of 1887 came to the Redhorn Basin like a punishment nobody had earned. By the second week of July, the thermometer nailed to the side of Caleb Ashford's barn had stopped being useful. It only read to 110, and the mercury had been pressing against the top of the glass since mid-June. The air itself felt thick, wrong, like breathing through a wool blanket someone had left in the sun. Lizards didn't move during the day anymore. They'd learned better. Caleb was 31 years old, lean in the way that came from not quite enough food over too many years, with hands that had more scar tissue than smooth skin left on them. He'd come out to the Redhorn Basin 3 years ago with Elena, a land claim, $200 in savings, and the kind of stubborn optimism that frontier country either rewarded or destroyed. The basin had been working on the second option for about 8 months now. He stood at the edge of what used to be his well and dropped a stone in. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The small, distant plunk at the bottom told him everything he needed to know. "How bad?" Elena called from the porch. He didn't answer right away. She'd hear it in his voice if he wasn't careful, and Elena could read him like a surveyor's map. He turned and walked back toward the house, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Maybe 4 feet left," he said. "Maybe less." She was sitting on the porch steps, shelling dried beans into a clay bowl. She kept shelling. Her hands didn't stop. That was Elena's way. Keep working. Keep moving. Don't let the fear settle in your muscles, or it would never leave. "And the Garver Creek?" "Dry since April. I checked yesterday." She nodded slowly. The beans made small clicking sounds against the bowl. Elena Ashford was 28, dark-haired, built with the kind of practical toughness that came from being the oldest daughter in a family that couldn't afford weakness. She'd grown up in a sod house in Kansas. She knew drought. She'd watched her father lose 2 farms to it before she was 15. She had not married Caleb to lose another one, and the set of her jaw said so even when she wasn't speaking. "The Kellers pulled out last week," she said. "I heard." "The Dunns are packing." "I know." She set this bowl down and looked at him. "Caleb." "Elena." "I'm not saying I want to leave." She paused. "I'm saying we have to think about it seriously, like adults." He sat down on the step beside her. The wood was hot even in the shade. "We've got the goats. If we can keep them through the summer, we've lost 4 goats in 3 weeks. I know that. The tansy doe died this morning." He hadn't known that. He'd been out since before dawn checking the eastern fence line where the coyotes had been testing it. He rubbed his face with both hands. "Damn. She was the best milker we had." The two of them sat there in the terrible heat, not talking. Down in the makeshift pen below the barn, he could hear the remaining goats moving restlessly, their hooves on the dry ground making a sound like someone shuffling papers. There were 9 left. A month ago, there'd been 14. The land around their homestead looked like the surface of a different planet. Red sandstone formations rose in broken columns and shelves on 3 sides, blocking the wind that might have brought relief. The creek bed that had promised good irrigation when they'd first filed the claim had been nothing but cracked mud since spring. The winter wheat was gone. The kitchen garden was barely hanging on with the little water they hauled out to it each evening, and even so, half of it was already past saving. "Let me check on the herd," Caleb said finally. "Then we'll talk." He walked down to the goat pen. The animals were agitated, moving in tight circles in the small shade thrown by the lean-to. He counted heads. 8. He counted again. 8. He turned around, scanning the terrain. The gate latch was old and sometimes worked itself loose on its own. He walked the fence line, checking for gaps. On the north side, where the sandstone shelf jutted out close to the pen, he found it. A broken board low to the ground, pushed outward. He followed the trail of disturbed dust and scattered droppings north, into the narrow corridor between the sandstone formations. The sun hit the rock face at this hour and threw back the heat like a furnace door. He pulled his hat lower and kept walking. He found the goat about 200 yards in, standing with her nose pressed against a vertical crack in the cliff face. It was a narrow thing, 8, maybe 10 inches wide at its widest point, running from the ground up about 6 feet before the rock closed back in. The goat, a brown and white doe he'd named Pepper for the spots along her back, wasn't trying to get past it. She was just standing there, completely still, her nose working. "Come on, girl," Caleb said, reaching for her collar. And then he felt it. A breath. Cool, faintly damp, pressing out of the crack against his hand and forearm like something alive. He froze. In the 100-and-something-degree heat of that canyon corridor, the sensation was so wrong, so completely out of place, that his brain took a full 3 seconds to process it. He pressed his hand flat against the crack. The cool air kept coming, steady and faint, like the exhalation of something sleeping deep in the rock. He put his ear to the opening. Water. Not rain, not wind. The unmistakable sound of moving water, somewhere far back in the dark. He left Pepper tied to a scrub oak and ran back to the house at a dead sprint, which he hadn't done in months, because running in that heat was a good way to end up flat on your back. He hit the porch at full speed and nearly knocked Elena over. "Whoa!" She grabbed his arm. "What happened? Are you hurt? Come with me." He was already turning back around. "Right now. Bring the lantern." "Caleb, please." "Elena, right now." She read his face. Not panic, something else. Something she couldn't quite name. And she went inside and came back with the lantern and a box of matches without another word. He led her back through the corridor, past the sandstone formations, to the crack in the cliff. He put her hand against the opening before he said anything. She went very still. "Is that... feel it? It's cold." "Listen." She leaned in. The sound of water was faint but unmistakable. A trickling, moving sound, rhythmic and real. Elena pulled back and looked at him. Her face was unreadable for a moment, the way it got when she was doing the math on something in her head. "How wide is the passage?" "Not wide, but I think I can fit." "I'm smaller than you." "Elena." "Which means I go first." She picked up the lantern and shook the oil to check the level. "Give me a match." They lit the lantern. She turned sideways and pressed into the crack. The lantern held out ahead of her, and Caleb's heart was doing something unpleasant in his chest as he watched her disappear into the rock. "I can see it widening," she called back. Her voice was oddly muffled by the stone. "About 10 feet in. Come on." He turned sideways and pushed in after her. The rock pressed against his chest and back simultaneously, and for a moment he had a very specific fear of getting stuck and dying wedged in a cliff face in the Arizona territory. But he kept moving, kept his shoulders angled, scraped his elbow raw on the stone, and then the pressure released and he was standing upright in a passage wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side. The lantern threw long, jumping shadows. The passage sloped downward, the floor worn smooth by water that must have run through it at some point, centuries or millennia ago. The air was noticeably cooler, not cold, but maybe 20 degrees less than the inferno outside, which felt like a miracle. And the sound of water was louder now. They followed the passage for another 40 feet, ducking once under a low shelf, stepping over a ridge of stone. Then it opened. The cavern was not large, maybe 30 feet across, with a ceiling that arched up about 15 feet at its highest. But along the far wall, emerging from a fracture in the limestone bedrock, was a spring. Clear water welled up from the rock and ran in a channel across the cavern floor before disappearing into a lower crack on the opposite side. Elena walked straight to it. She knelt down, put her hand in the flow. She brought the water to her lips. She sat there for a long moment, her back to Caleb. When she turned around, her eyes were bright in the lantern light. "It's good," she said. "It's clean." Caleb sat down on the cave floor, which he hadn't planned on doing. His legs had simply stopped holding him up. He looked at the spring, at the steady, unhurried, beautiful flow of water coming out of the desert bedrock, and he felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for months. "How much do you think it flows?" he said. "I don't know." "Enough." Elena was running her hands along the channel the water carved in the cave floor. Her voice had changed completely. The careful flatness was gone, and something focused, almost urgent, had taken its place. "This goes somewhere. The outlet. If we can trace where it goes, it might come out somewhere on the surface. Or we bring it out." She looked at him. "We could dig. Extend the channel. Caleb, if we could route this to the surface, that's a lot of rock between here and the passage we came through. The floor was water-worn. This water used to flow out that way. There may not be as much between here and the surface as we think." She stood up. She was already mapping something in her head. He could see it. "We'd need to survey the topography, figure out the elevation change, calculate how much we'd have to excavate versus build." "Elena, we don't have the tools for... We have pickaxes, we have timber, we have time. Because if we don't do this, we're leaving anyway, so we lose nothing by trying." She walked back toward him. "Caleb, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for." He looked at her face in the lantern light, and what he saw there, the absolute conviction, the slightly terrifying certainty, did what it always did to him. It made him believe her. "All right," he said. "We figure out the route first, then we plan. Then we work. Then we work." She reached down and offered him her hand. He took it and let her pull him to his feet. They stood there for a moment in the cool dark, listening to the water move through stone, while outside the desert baked and cracked under a sky like hammered copper. They spent the next 2 days mapping. Elena was methodical about it in a way that sometimes made Caleb feel like he'd married someone who should have been an engineer instead of a frontier homesteader's wife. She had him hammer stakes along the surface topography while she ran a string line and used a hand level she'd bought at a hardware store in Tucson the year before. She filled 3 pages of her ledger with elevation measurements, sketched cross-sections, estimated distances. Caleb brought water up from the spring in buckets while she worked, hauling it through the crack 2 gallons at a time until his arms felt like overcooked rope. He watered the kitchen garden. He watered the goats. Pepper, who had found the cave to begin with, got an extra tin of water that he told Elena was a practical necessity and that she did not need to know about in detail. "How's the garden looking?" Elena asked that second evening, without looking up from her ledger. "Cabbages might make it. The beans are better than they were." "Good." She turned the ledger toward him. "Look at this." She'd drawn a profile of the terrain between the cavern and the homestead. The spring sat at a higher elevation than most of their field. Not dramatically higher, but enough. The passage they'd squeezed through tracked almost due south before it reached the cliff face. "If we widen the existing passage," she said, running her finger along the sketch, "we only have to excavate maybe 15 feet of new channel through soft sandstone before we're outside the cliff. After that, we're building a surface channel on a grade that'll carry the flow naturally to the field. Widening that passage isn't nothing. Some of that is solid rock. The section near the entrance is mostly compressed sediment. We can pick through it. The section near the cave I'm less sure about. Might need to go around the east side, add 12 feet, but avoid the hard shelf entirely." He studied the sketch. She'd marked grades and distances in her small, precise handwriting. "You've been thinking about this since we found it, haven't you?" "I've been thinking about nothing else since we found it." He looked up at her. She had a smear of pencil lead on her cheek, and her hair was pinned up in the functional way she wore it when she meant business. And she was watching him with that look that meant she'd already decided, but was giving him the courtesy of catching up. "Timber for the surface channel," he said. "We don't have enough." "I know. I've been thinking about that. The Harmon property east of the mesa. They abandoned it in April. There's a barn there, partially standing. I'd bet the timber in it is usable. That's salvage off an abandoned claim. Technically, the Harmons haven't registered an abandonment with the land office, which means the claim is still in their name, which means we'd need to ask permission." She paused. "I was thinking I'd write them a letter." "You know where they went?" "Mrs. Harmon's sister lives in Flagstaff. I have the address from when we borrowed their handcart 2 winters ago." He was quiet for a moment. "And if they say no, or we don't hear back in time?" "Then we find another solution." She closed the ledger. "But we start digging tomorrow." He thought about the 4 dead goats. about the dry well and the cracked creek bed, and the families pulling up their stakes and leaving. About the stone surface of this territory that had been refusing them for 8 months. He thought about the cool air coming out of the crack in the cliff face. "We start digging tomorrow," he agreed. "Boss." The work was unlike anything either of them had done before, and they had both done a great deal of hard things. The first week was the passage. Caleb did the heavy excavation, swinging the pickaxe in the narrow space, breaking up the compressed sediment that blocked the passage's widest section, hauling the debris out in a canvas sack one load at a time. Elena worked beside him whenever the space allowed, using a shorter-handled hatchet to chip at the walls and a flat bar to pry loose the bigger pieces. They established a system without talking much about it. Caleb broke the material. Elena cleared it. They switched when one of them was too tired to be effective, and the other one kept going. They stopped when the air in the passage got too stale to breathe comfortably, came out, worked on the surface channel while they recovered, went back in. The surface channel was different work. A trench dug through the rocky soil outside the cliff face, lined with flat stones to prevent erosion, sloping continuously toward the field. It required less brute force and more precision. Elena had an eye for grade that Caleb genuinely admired. She could look at a 50-foot span of ground and tell him within an inch where to cut deep and where to cut shallow to maintain the flow. On the 5th day, a rider came down the track toward their place. Caleb was working shirtless in the trench, and Elena was in the passage when they heard the hoofbeats. It was Henry Briggs, who had a ranch about 4 miles north and had been one of their few remaining neighbors since the spring exodus began. He was a compact, cautious man in his late 40s who didn't waste words. He pulled up at the edge of the trench, looked at it, looked at Caleb, looked at the mound of excavated rock and soil. "What are you building?" he said. "Water channel?" "From where?" Caleb hesitated. He and Elena hadn't talked about how much to say to people yet. They hadn't had to, because no one had come by. "Found a spring," he said finally. Henry's horse shifted under him. The man's face didn't change much, but something moved behind his eyes. "Underground?" "Yes." "How much flow?" "We're still figuring that out." Henry was quiet for a moment. "We're down to almost nothing ourselves. Last 2 weeks." "I know." Caleb straightened up, wiped his hands on his trousers. "Once we get this working, we'll know better what we've got. Come back in a couple of weeks." Henry looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, like something had been settled, and rode back north. Elena had come out of the passage during the exchange. She was standing at the cliff face listening. "He's going to tell people," she said. "Probably." "Are you all right with that?" Caleb picked up his pickaxe. "Ask me when it's working." By the end of the 2nd week, they had completed the excavated section of the passage and the full run of surface channel from the cliff face to the edge of their field. What remained was connecting the channel inside the cavern to the spring itself, routing the water into the carved passage instead of letting it run off into the lower crack, and then opening the passage mouth so the flow could make the full journey to the surface. This was Elena's domain. She spent half a day inside the cavern with a candle and her ledger, measuring and thinking, and she came out with dirt on her knees and a plan. "We need to build a small diversion," she said. "A low wall of fitted stone across the channel here." She sketched it, to redirect the flow into the passage entrance instead of letting it drain down through the floor. It doesn't need to be high, 6, 8 inches. The pressure from the spring will do the rest. How do we seal it? We don't have mortar. We don't need mortar. We pack it with clay from the creek bed. It's dry as bone right now, but it'll be good clay when we wet it down. Clay-packed stone will hold against this volume of flow. Caleb thought about it. "That's smart." "I know," she said, without any particular pride in it, which was how she said most things. They hauled clay from the old creek bed, crumbling it from the cracked mud, loading it into buckets, carrying it to the cave. The work in the cavern was oddly peaceful compared to the passage excavation. The temperature was comfortable, the air was still, and the sound of the spring filled the space with a constant, gentle white noise that Caleb found himself listening to when his mind wandered. Elena fitted the stones by hand, testing each one against its neighbors, packing the gaps with wetted clay. She worked with the concentration of someone diffusing something. Caleb handed her stones and held things steady when she needed 2 points of pressure simultaneously. "Talk to me," she said at one point, "about something else." "Something else than what?" Then whether this is going to work. He thought about it. When we were first driving out here, you remember that family we passed on the road, going the other way? Wagon piled high. I remember. The woman was sitting up top. She had this look on her face. He paused. I couldn't figure it out at the time, whether she was sad or relieved or what. Both, probably. I keep thinking about her lately. Elena was packing clay into a gap with her thumb. You're wondering if we'll end up like that. I was wondering if she'd made the right call. Elena stopped working. She turned to look at him in the candlelight, and her expression was very direct, the way it got when she was going to say something she meant completely. She made the call that was right for her circumstances. We're making the call that's right for ours. She turned back to the wall. Hand me that flat piece. He handed her the stone. She set it, checked it, pressed it down. Besides, she said, I am not hauling our things back over that road in a wagon. My back hurt for 2 weeks when we came out. He laughed. A real laugh. The first one in a while. It bounced off the cavern walls and came back at them from 3 directions. But on the 17th day, they opened the passage. Caleb broke through the last section of compressed sediment from inside, and light came in from the surface. A hot, bright shaft of afternoon sun that felt almost violent after the dim coolness of the cave. He cleared the opening to the width they'd planned, packed the edges, and went back to Elena. She was crouched at the diversion wall, a candle held close to watch the water level. Ready, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. All right, she said. She lifted the flat stone they'd left loose at one end of the diversion wall, the plug they'd been calling it, and set it into the final gap. The clay held. The low wall diverted the spring's flow cleanly into the carved passage entrance. For a moment, nothing visible happened, because the passage was long and it took time. They went out through the entrance crack. There was a wider opening now. They'd worked on it, still tight but manageable, and stood at the head of the surface channel and waited. Caleb heard it before he saw it. A soft, rushing sound, growing. Then the glint of water appearing at the passage mouth, spreading into the stone-lined channel, beginning its long run down the slope toward the field. Elena made a sound that wasn't words. She covered her mouth with both hands. The water kept coming, steady and clear, running through the channel they'd carved out of the desert with their own hands over 17 days of the worst heat of the summer. Caleb put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they watched the water run. It's working, she said. Her voice was muffled by her own hands. It's working, he said. Down at the field, the water reached the first depression they'd carved as a collection point and began to pool. The dry, cracked earth soaked it up immediately, pulling it down as fast as it came. But it kept coming. The spring didn't falter. They stood there for a long time, watching it. The goats, restless in their pen below the barn, heard or smelled the water and set up a racket that carried across the whole empty basin. Pepper, the brown and white doe who had started it all by pressing her nose against a crack in the stone, was loudest of all. Caleb laughed again. Couldn't help it. All right, he said, pulling away to walk down to the pen. Come on, then. He opened the gate and let them out. 9 goats came tumbling through and ran down the slope toward the water with a kind of ungainly, desperate enthusiasm that made Elena laugh too. And then they were both standing in the last hour of the afternoon, laughing in the red-gold light while the water ran and the goats drank and the desert accepted, grudgingly, that it was not going to win this particular argument. Not today, anyway. That night they ate the last of the salted pork with dried beans and a handful of the cabbages from the kitchen garden that had survived. It wasn't much, but they sat at the table together without the weight that had been living in that room for months, and the food tasted better than it had any right to. We'll need to expand the field, Elena said. I know, and reinforce some of the channel sections. The grade is a little steep in the middle section. I want to add some check stones to slow the flow before it erodes the lining. Tomorrow. And we need to write to the Harmons. They never replied. I want to offer them something for the barn timber, now that we actually have something to offer. Tomorrow, Elena. She looked at him. You want me to stop planning? Just for tonight. She thought about it. All right. She refilled his cup from the water pitcher, the water from their spring, carried up in buckets, clean and cold and completely, impossibly real. One more thing, she said. What? We're going to need to tell Henry Briggs. She folded her hands on the table. And whoever else he's already told. Caleb looked down at his cup. The water caught the lamplight and held it. I know, he said. I know we do. Outside, the desert was quiet except for the faint, continuous sound of water moving through stone channels in the dark. The goats were settled, the stars were out. The summer heat was still there, pressing down from all sides, as relentless and indifferent as it had always been. But the water was running, and that changed everything. Henry Briggs came back 11 days later, same as he'd said he would. Or close enough, anyway. He rode in just before noon with a second horse trailing behind him, and on that second horse sat a woman Caleb didn't recognize. She was maybe 60, with white hair pinned tight under a sun-faded bonnet and the kind of posture that suggested she'd spent a lifetime refusing to let hard country bend her spine. This is my mother-in-law, Henry said, dismounting. Vera Solt. She was a school teacher in Ohio before she came out here. She's good with numbers. Caleb and Elena exchanged a look. You brought an accountant, Elena said. I brought someone who thinks straight, Henry said. Figured you'd want that. Vera Solt climbed down from her horse without assistance, dusted off her skirt, and looked at the channel running along the base of the field with an expression of careful interest. How much flow? She asked. Not hello, not pleased to meet you, just straight to it. About 12 gallons a minute at the spring mouth, Elena said. We lose maybe a quarter to seepage and evaporation by the time it reaches the lower collection point. Vera nodded. And you've been running it how long? 11 days continuously. Any drop in output from the spring itself? Nothing we can measure. The older woman walked the length of the channel without another word, studying the grade, the stone lining, the check stones Elena had added to slow the middle section. She crouched down at one point and pressed her fingers into the clay packing at a joint. She stood back up and kept walking. Henry watched her with the patient look of a man who had learned not to rush this particular process. When Vera came back, she pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket and opened it. I've been speaking to the other families in the basin, she said. There are 7 households still holding on. 4 of them are at critical water levels. The Dutton family lost their last horse 2 weeks ago. Couldn't keep the animal watered. The Pellegrini brothers are down to 1 meal a day to conserve. She looked at Elena directly. What you've built here is enough to sustain your homestead. Extended properly, it could sustain 6 or 7 more. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight in it. Extended properly, Caleb said carefully. What does that look like in practice? It looks like more channels, Vera said without softening it. More excavation, more timber, more labor than 2 people can provide. She paused. But the 7 families still in this basin represent 14 able-bodied adults, not counting older children who can carry and haul. If the labor is shared, the extension is possible. Elena was quiet for a moment. Caleb could see her thinking, not hesitating, thinking, which looked similar from the outside but was completely different on the inside. The spring belongs to our claim, Elena said. Legally, we filed on this land and the water source falls within its boundaries. I know that, Vera said. Nobody's disputing it. I'm not saying we won't share it. I'm saying we need to be clear about what we're building here before we build it. Because once we start running water to other properties, we're committed. There's no clean way to pull back from that. Vera Solt looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the old woman's face. Not softening, exactly, but something like respect. You're right to say so, she said. Which is why I think we need an agreement. Written, signed by all parties. Rights of access, responsibilities for maintenance, fair distribution during low-flow periods. You can draft that, Caleb said. I've been drafting it for a week, Vera said. She turned a page in her notebook. I'd like to go over the terms with both of you, if you're willing. They sat on the porch for 2 hours, the 4 of them, while Vera went through the document she'd written in her school teacher's hand. It wasn't a legal contract in any formal sense. There was no lawyer within 50 miles and no courthouse that had jurisdiction over water agreements between private settlers. But it was clear and specific, and Elena read every line of it twice and asked questions that made Henry shift uncomfortably in his chair, though he never said anything. When they were done, Elena looked at Caleb. I think it's fair, she said. So do I. We'll need to meet with the other families. All of them, before we start anything. I can arrange that, Henry said. End of the week. Good. Elena folded the document and set it on the table. One more thing. She looked at Vera. The extension is going to need to reach the Pellegrini property first. They're the most critical. Vera nodded. I had it that way in the original routing draft. You drew a routing draft? 2 weeks ago. Elena looked at the older woman with an expression that Caleb recognized. It was the same one she'd had looking at the cavern spring the first time, the one that meant she had just found something genuinely useful in an unlikely place. How far is the Pellegrini claim? Elena asked Henry. Little over a mile north-northeast. Elevation? Lower than you. Then we're running with the grade, Elena said. She stood up. I want to see the terrain between here and there before the meeting. Can you take me tomorrow? Henry blinked. Yes, I can do that. Early, before it gets too hot to think. She picked up the document again. I'll make a copy of this tonight so we each have one. She looked at Vera. Thank you for the work you put into this. Vera Solt looked slightly surprised, which suggested she wasn't thanked often. Don't thank me yet, she said. The hard work hasn't started. What? She was right about that. The meeting at the end of the week brought together all 7 remaining families at the Ashford place, which suddenly felt considerably smaller with 23 people standing in and around the yard. Caleb had set up rough benches from scrap timber. Elena had made coffee, which required using the last of their coffee supply, and had not mentioned this fact to Caleb until after she'd done it. I'll point out the obvious, he said quietly, watching people find seats. We needed something to offer them besides a speech, she said. That was our last. I know what it was, Caleb. He let it go. The families ran the spectrum of frontier experience. There were the Pellegrini brothers, Marco and Tomas, both in their mid-30s, Italian-born, who had come to the territory via California and spoke good English with an accent that thickened when they were agitated. There was the Dutton family, Walt, his wife Ruth, and their 3 children ranging from about 8 to 15. Walt Dutton was a big, quiet man who said very little and observed everything. Ruth did the talking for both of them and was good at it. There were 2 bachelor homesteaders, a red-headed Irishman called Dermot Canty and an older man named Silas Prue, who had a gray beard down to his collarbone and the permanently squinting expression of someone who'd spent decades staring at things that disappointed him. And then there was Agnes Thorne. Caleb had met Agnes Thorne twice before, briefly, and both times he'd come away with the feeling that he'd missed something important. She ran a homestead about 2 miles east entirely on her own, since her husband had died of a snakebite the previous spring. She was 40-something, with strong hands and a way of listening that made people nervous because she so rarely responded immediately. She waited. She considered. Then she said whatever she meant. When Elena finished laying out the plan, the spring, the extension routes, the agreement, the shared labor structure, it was Agnes Thorne who spoke first. Who decides distribution when the flow drops? She said. Low water year, not enough for everybody. Who makes the call? Elena had been waiting for this one. The agreement establishes a committee, 1 representative from each property. Majority vote for distribution decisions during shortage periods. No single family has override authority. Including yours, Agnes said. Including ours. Agnes looked at her. It's your spring. It's our spring, Elena said. We filed on it, but we can't use this water to hold people over a barrel, and we won't. That's not what this is. A pause. Then Agnes Thorne nodded once, the slow, definitive kind that meant she had made a decision and would not be revisiting it. Marco Pellegrini leaned forward. The work. How long before water reaches our property? 3 weeks, Elena said. Maybe 4 if we hit hard rock on the northern run. But your claim is the priority route. You'll be first. Marco looked at his brother. Something passed between them in Italian, quick and quiet. Tomas nodded. We work, Marco said. Whatever you need. Walt Dutton raised his hand, which he immediately seemed to feel self-conscious about, because he lowered it. My oldest boy, he said. Thomas. He's 15, strong for his age. He can work a full adult shift. We'll take him, Caleb said. My younger 2 can haul. Light work. We'll find use for them. Dermot Canty, the Irishman, had been sitting with his elbows on his knees, studying the ground. He looked up. I've done mine work, he said. Back in Ireland, then Nevada. I know something about moving rock in tight passages. He glanced toward the cliff face. I'd like to look at your tunnel. Tomorrow morning, Caleb said. You and me. Bring your own candle. Silas Prue, the last one, hadn't said a word through any of it. He sat at the end of the back bench with his arms crossed and his squinting expression fixed on the middle distance. Finally, when it seemed like the meeting might be wrapping up, he said, What do we do about Harlow? The name landed on the gathering like a dropped plate. Several people shifted. Henry Briggs' expression went carefully neutral. Caleb said, What about Harlow? He's got claims on 3 properties between here and the Pellegrini land. Paper claims. He bought the debt notes when those families left. Technically, he owns easement rights over that ground. Caleb looked at Elena. She was already thinking. Is that recorded with the land office? She said. I couldn't say for sure, Silas said, but Harlow's been making noise about it. Told the Duttons 2 weeks ago that any water infrastructure running across those parcels would need his written permission. Ruth Dutton spoke up. He came to our place, she said. He was very polite about it. Very polite. The way she said it made clear that the politeness had not been comforting. He said he was just making sure everyone understood the legal landscape. His words. Who is Harlow? Elena asked. She'd been in the homestead when that exchange had apparently happened, and nobody had thought to mention it to her before now. Everett Harlow, Henry said. He came into the basin about a year ago, runs a dry goods operation out of a store in Cutter's Ford, about 12 miles east. Since the drought started, he's been buying up debt notes on struggling homesteads. Nobody thought much of it at first. Seemed like he was doing people a favor, taking on their debts, letting them walk away clean. But now he holds paper on 5 or 6 abandoned claims. And the 3 between here and the Pellegrini property, Silas said. Caleb felt a cold, specific feeling settle in his stomach. He recognized it from other contexts. It was the feeling of a problem that hadn't shown itself fully yet. The route can't go around those parcels? He asked Elena. She shook her head. Not without adding 2 miles of channel and going over ground that's 15 feet higher in elevation. We'd need a pump we don't have. She looked at Silas. Has Harlow said explicitly that he'd deny permission? No. Said he'd need to evaluate any proposal. Said there'd be a fee for easement rights. How much of a fee? Marco Pellegrini asked. Silas spread his hands. He wasn't specific. The meeting ended without resolution on the Harlow question, which bothered Caleb more than he let on. The other families stayed and talked in small clusters, and the Pellegrini brothers helped him carry the remaining bench timber back to the barn, and by the time everyone had ridden or walked away, the sun was dropping behind the western rock formations and throwing long red shadows across the yard. Elena was sitting on the porch steps when he came back from the barn, her ledger open on her knee, though she wasn't writing in it. We need to talk to Harlow, she said. I figured you'd say that. Before we start building the northern extension, before we commit the labor and materials. She tapped her pencil against the open page. If he's going to block us, I want to know now, not when we're halfway through. And if he wants a fee we can't pay? She was quiet for a moment. Then we figure out the alternate route. We make it work even if it's harder. 2 miles of extra channel, uphill, no pump. I said harder, not impossible. She closed the ledger. Let me come with you when you go to see him. I was planning on it, he said. She glanced at him sideways. You sure about that? Because the last time I came along to a business discussion, you said I scared the man. You did scare him. He was being dishonest. He was the supply trader, Elena. He just charged us too much for wire. He was being dishonest, she said again, with finality. She stood up. I'm coming. I know you are. They rode to Cutter's Ford 3 days later, leaving Dermot Canty in charge of the ongoing excavation work. Canty had turned out to be exactly what he'd advertised. Efficient in tight spaces, comfortable with the noise and dust of moving rock, and possessed of a dark, dry humor that kept the mood in the passage from becoming oppressive. In 3 days, he'd advanced the Northern Channel route further than Caleb and Elena had managed in their first week. Cutter's Ford was not much. A main street with a dozen buildings, a well that still had water in it, though not much, a handful of residents who had decided to stay and service the surrounding territory. Harlow's dry goods store occupied the largest building on the street, a whitewashed structure with a covered porch and a sign painted in careful letters. Everett Harlow was behind the counter when they came in. He was maybe 50, well-dressed for a frontier merchant, with a neat mustache and the kind of relaxed, professional smile that he clearly maintained whether he meant it or not. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "and Mrs. Ashford, I was wondering when you'd come by." "You were expecting us," Elena said. "Word travels." He gestured toward two chairs he'd set out near the counter, which suggested the word had traveled with enough specificity that he knew they weren't here to buy anything. "Please." They sat. He stayed standing, which Caleb noted. "We're building a water distribution system," Caleb said. "I think you've heard about it." "I've heard the broad strokes," Harlow said pleasantly. "The northern extension runs across 3 parcels where you hold debt notes. We'd like to discuss easement rights." "Of course." Harlow folded his hands on the counter. "I want to be straightforward with you. I have nothing but goodwill toward what you're doing. The water situation in the basin is serious, and I admire the initiative. However, I do have legal obligations as a debt holder to protect the value of the properties in question." "We'd be improving those properties," Elena said. "A water channel running through a parcel increases its land value." "That's one perspective," Harlow said. "Another perspective is that a water infrastructure system running through my parcels creates ongoing maintenance obligations, right-of-way complications, and potential liability if the system causes erosion or flooding damage." "We can address each of those concerns in writing," Elena said. "We have a community agreement drafted. It includes maintenance responsibilities and damage liability provisions." Harlow's smile stayed. "I'd want my own attorney to review any such document." "That's reasonable," Elena said. "What's the fee?" "I beg your pardon?" "Silas Prue told us you mentioned a fee for easement rights. I'm asking what that fee is." A small pause. The smile adjusted slightly. "I wouldn't want to put a number on it before I've seen the full proposal." "Mr. Harlow," Elena's voice was even, "we have 14 adults ready to start work on the northern extension. Every day we wait is a day the Pellegrini brothers don't have water, and they are at critical levels. I'd prefer not to waste time. What is the fee?" Harlow looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb, which was a miscalculation on his part, because Caleb said nothing and looked back at him with an expression that communicated clearly that Elena spoke for both of them. $5 per parcel, Harlow said. $15 total. One-time fee. $15. Caleb ran it through his head. They had maybe $22 in actual cash savings, which was meant to cover seeds for the fall planting and wire for the fence repair, and 3 other things he could name without thinking hard. He looked at Elena. She was looking at Harlow. "We'll need the agreement reviewed and signed within 1 week, she said. "If we don't have your signature in 7 days, we pursue the alternate route and your parcels remain without water access indefinitely." Something moved in Harlow's eyes. He'd considered, Caleb guessed, that they had no real alternative and that the fee could be negotiated upward over time. Elena had just told him, clearly, that wasn't the situation. 1 week is reasonable, Harlow said after a moment. "Good." Elena stood. "We'll have a copy of the community agreement to you by tomorrow." They were almost to the door when Harlow spoke again. "Mrs. Ashford." They turned. He was still behind the counter, his expression still pleasant, professionally pleasant, the kind you couldn't quite read under. "I hope you understand I'm not your adversary in this." Elena looked at him. "I don't think you are," she said. "I think you're a businessman who saw an opportunity and took it, and now you're recalibrating because the landscape changed." She held his gaze. "We're just making sure you understand the landscape." Outside, the heat hit them like a fist. They walked to where the horses were tied and untied them and stood there for a moment before mounting. $15, Caleb said. "I know. That's almost everything we have." "I know. Was it worth saying what you said in there? At the end?" Elena thought about it. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. "Yes," she said, "because now he knows exactly who he's dealing with, and he'll think twice before he causes problems later." Caleb mounted his horse. They turned north, back toward the basin, and rode through the white midday heat with the sun pounding down on the red rock and the dust rising behind them. The $15 was almost everything, but the northern channel extension would reach the Pellegrini brothers, and the other families would have water, and Everett Harlow had been looked at directly and found to be, if not a friend, then at least a solvable problem. That was enough, Caleb decided, for one day. Harlow signed the easement agreement on the sixth day, which was one day earlier than Elena had given him, and which Caleb suspected meant the man had spent the intervening time trying to find leverage he didn't have, and finally accepting the fact. The document came back with one amendment, a clause specifying that any expansion of the water system beyond its current planned route would require renegotiation of easement terms. Elena read it twice, crossed the kitchen to the window, stood there for 30 seconds, and came back and signed it. "He's trying to position himself for the future," she said, handing the document to Caleb. "Is that a problem? Not today. Ask me in 2 years." She picked up her ledger. "Come on. Dermot found something in the North Passage, and I want to look at it before we lose the morning light." What Dermot had found was a section of the Northern Channel route where the bedrock changed composition. From the soft sandstone they'd been working through to a shelf of dense volcanic rock about 6 feet thick that ran across the planned path like a wall. They stood at the edge of it in the early morning, Dermot crouching with a candle held close to the surface, running his fingers along the grain of the rock with the professional intimacy of a man who had spent years learning what stone would and wouldn't do. "We can go through it," he said. "But it'll cost us a week, maybe 10 days. "Can we go under it?" Elena asked. "Deeper channel? No. We'd lose too much grade. Under this section, we'd be running uphill by the time we came out the other side." "Over it?" Dermot looked up at her. "It's a shelf, not a wall. Tops out about 2 feet above grade. We could build an elevated timber trough to carry the flow over the surface, drop it back into the channel on the far side." "We don't have the timber for that," Caleb said. "We have the Harmon barn timber," Elena said. "We got the letter 2 weeks ago. Agnes Thorne offered to haul it. She has the wagon." Caleb thought about it. "A timber trough over hard rock in desert heat. It'll dry and crack." "We pitched the inside," Dermot said. "Pine tar. Keeps it sealed. I've seen it done in mining operations. Water troughs in the Nevada hills. They hold for years with proper maintenance." "Do we have pine tar?" "No," Elena said. "But the Pellegrini brothers have a tin of it in their equipment stores. Marco told me last week. They brought it out from California and never used it." Caleb looked at her. "You've been thinking about this already." "I've been thinking about everything already," she said without apology. The Pellegrini brothers brought the pine tar that afternoon, Marco driving their mule cart with Tomas riding beside him, and they stayed and worked. The system they'd built for sharing labor had fallen into a rhythm over the past 3 weeks that felt, to Caleb, both natural and slightly improbable. People who barely knew each other's last names showing up each morning with tools and leaving each evening tired and dust-covered, with something additional accomplished that none of them could have done alone. Walt Dutton's boy Thomas had turned out to be the hardest-working 15-year-old Caleb had ever seen. He didn't talk much, just put his head down and moved rock, and he had developed a specific talent for anticipating what needed to happen next without being told. Caleb had started relying on him in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable, because the boy was 15 and Caleb didn't want to be the kind of man who worked a child past his limits. He mentioned it to Ruth Dutton one morning when she brought the midday water. "He's all right," Ruth said. "He'd be home doing nothing useful otherwise. At least here he can see what the work is for." She handed Caleb a cup and looked out at the channel progress. Walt was the same way at that age, needed to see the purpose before he could commit to the effort. "Your husband doesn't say much," Caleb said. "He says everything he needs to," Ruth said. "Just not out loud." She refilled his cup before he'd asked for it. "He thinks you and your wife are the real thing. That means something, coming from Walt." Caleb wasn't entirely sure what to do with that, so he drank his water. The timber trough went up in 4 days. It was rough work. Not pretty, functional. A pitched pine frame spanning the volcanic shelf, with the interior sealed in 3 coats of pine tar that made the whole section smell like a naval yard in high summer. When they tested it with a bucket of water, it leaked in 2 places, which Dermot sealed with a 3rd local application, muttering things under his breath in what Caleb assumed was Irish, though he couldn't be certain. On the 2nd test, it held. The Northern Channel extension reached the Pellegrini brothers' property on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of August, and Marco Pellegrini, who had not visibly shown emotion through any of the preceding weeks of work, sat down on the ground when he saw the water come through and covered his face with his hands for a full minute. His brother stood beside him and said nothing and put one hand on his shoulder, and that was all. Nobody made a thing of it. They turned away and found other things to look at until he was ready to stand back up. What Caleb had not accounted for, what none of them had fully accounted for, was what the sky was doing while they worked. August in the Arizona Territory was monsoon season, technically. Most years the monsoons were mild enough to be a relief, afternoon thunderstorms that brought the temperature down and soaked into the cracked earth and were gone by evening. Some years they were nothing at all. Once in a while they were something else entirely. He noticed the clouds building on the third Saturday of August, the way you noticed a stranger walking toward you on an empty street. Not alarm exactly, but attention. They were building from the southwest, stacking up in massive towers of gray and purple that caught the afternoon light in ways that were genuinely beautiful if you weren't thinking about what they meant. Elena came out of the barn and stood beside him, looking at the same sky. "Those are high up," she said. "They are, and moving fast. Faster than usual." She looked at the channel running along the edge of the field, then at the cliff face where the passage entrance sat, then back at the clouds. "If we get real rain." "I know." "The canyon corridor, if it floods." "I know, Elena." She turned to look at him with an expression he recognized. Not panic, not the look that said she needed reassurance, but the practical, focused look that meant she was about to tell him something they needed to do immediately. "The checkstones in the middle channel section aren't weighted," she said. "If we get high-velocity water, they'll shift. We need to pin them." "What do we pin them with?" "Iron stakes. The fence repair supplies, the ones we haven't used yet." "That's 12 stakes. It's exactly what we need." He went for the stakes, and she went for the mallet, and they worked the middle channel section while the clouds built higher and the air changed. That particular change that anyone who'd spent time in desert country knew, where the air goes from dry and dead to charged and alive inside of 20 minutes. And the smell of rain appears out of nowhere when the rain is still miles away. Dermot Canty showed up while they were working. He'd been heading home, saw the clouds, and turned back. "What do you need?" he said. "South end of the channel where it feeds the collection pool," Elena said without looking up. "The intake banks aren't reinforced. Get rocks. Flat ones, heavy." Dermot dropped his jacket and went to work. He didn't ask how heavy or how many or where to find them. He just went. Henry Briggs arrived 20 minutes later with Thomas Dutton, who had apparently been at the Briggs property when Henry decided to ride toward the Ashford place rather than away from it. "Trough section," Caleb told them. "The timber over the volcanic shelf. If we get flash water coming down the canyon, it'll hit that section with pressure it wasn't built for." "What do we do with it?" Henry said. "Guy wires," Caleb said. "We lash it to the rock on both sides. If the current hits it, we at least give it a fighting chance of staying in place." "I've got rope," Thomas said. "Get it." The storm arrived without further warning at approximately 4 in the afternoon. It didn't build up to something. It simply became something, instantly and completely, the way desert storms did when they finally decided to commit. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of a minute. The wind came first, hard enough to lean into, carrying red dust and small gravel horizontally. Then the lightning, close enough that the crack and the flash were simultaneous and the air smelled like burning copper. Then the rain, not gentle, not building. A wall of water that hit like someone had upended a lake over the canyon. Caleb was at the trough section with Henry and Thomas when it hit. The rope was tied, but he didn't feel confident about it. They'd been working fast, and the anchor points on the east side were set into sandstone that was softer than he'd wanted. "Get back!" he shouted, because the canyon to the north had just made a sound like distant artillery, and he knew what that meant. The flash flood came down the canyon corridor 90 seconds later. It wasn't the apocalyptic wall of water that Frontier Stories described. It was worse than nothing, and better than his worst fear, which was how these things usually went. A surge of red-brown water 3 feet deep, moving at serious speed, carrying gravel and scrub brush, and the occasional piece of timber that had been left in the wrong place. It hit the channel system at the northern entry point, and the pressure change was immediate and visible. Henry grabbed Caleb's arm. The trough. The trough was taking it. The guy wires Caleb had been worried about were holding. The lashing on the east side was straining, and one of the lines had gone taut as a wire fence, but it held. The water coming over the volcanic shelf was too high. spilling over the sides of the trough in two places, but the trough itself was in place and the main flow was still contained. What was not holding was the south bank of the intake channel, where the floodwater was undercutting the stone lining and beginning to erode around the edges of the collection pool. "Elena!" Caleb shouted. She was already there. She and Dermot were working in the rain and the mud, moving stones, repacking the bank by hand, the water running past their knees as they worked. Elena was soaked through, hair plastered to her face, moving with the concentrated efficiency of someone who had simply decided not to acknowledge that the conditions were impossible. Caleb waded in beside her. The water was cold, cold in a way that was shocking against the ambient heat, disorienting. And the current pulled at his legs with surprising force for 3 feet of depth. He found the section she was working and started moving rocks. "The northwest corner," she said, raising her voice over the rain and the rushing water. "It's opening up. If we lose that corner, the whole pool undercuts." He waded to the northwest corner. The stone lining had shifted there. 2 of the larger flat stones had rotated out of position, and the bank behind them was soft and eroding visibly, small tongues of red mud peeling away into the current with each surge. He needed heavy stones. He needed both hands. He looked around, and Thomas Dutton was there, 15 years old, knee-deep in flash floodwater, looking at him with an expression that said he was ready. "Big ones," Caleb said. "Heavy as you can lift." Thomas went for rocks. Caleb positioned himself at the corner and held the eroded bank with his body weight, while the boy hauled stones, and they packed that corner together with wet hands in the middle of a flash flood, while the lightning cracked overhead, and the rain came down in solid curtains, and the entire system they'd built over 3 weeks groaned and flexed around them. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing anyone would want to repeat. Caleb's back would hurt for a week, and Elena would have bruised palms for days from moving stone against current, and Thomas Dutton would have a story he'd tell for the rest of his life about what it felt like to be 15 and useful in a real emergency. But the northwest corner held, and then, with the abruptness of a door closing, the rain slowed. The flash surge dropped. The canyon went from roaring to rushing to the sound of fast-moving water that was loud but no longer threatening. The clouds moved east, still lit with internal lightning, dragging their skirts across the desert floor. The sky in the west went from gray to orange to the specific bruised purple of a desert evening after a storm. Caleb stood in the middle of his field, soaked to the skin, mud to the knee, and looked at the channel system. It was damaged. The trough section had 2 broken boards on the east side, the guy wire having saved the frame but not prevented the water pressure from punching through the planking. 3 sections of the surface channel had shifted stones. The northwest corner of the collection pool looked like something had taken a bite out of it, but the water was still flowing. Through all of it, the damage, the improvised repairs, the whole improbable structure they'd cobbled together with salvaged timber and packed clay and iron stakes and rope. The water from the underground spring was still moving through the channels, still reaching the collection pool, still finding its way to the field. Dermot walked up beside him, wringing water from the hem of his shirt. "Well," Dermot said. "Well," Caleb agreed. "It held. Most of it." "Most of it is what you want, in a flood," Dermot said. He looked at the trough section. "I can fix the boards in a day. 2 days if the timber we need is cut from scratch." "We've got some spare planking in the barn," Caleb said. "1 day, then." Elena came up on Caleb's other side. She was carrying her ledger, which she had apparently gone back to the house for at some point during the storm, and it was damp at the edges, but intact. She opened it to a page of notes she'd been making. "The northwest corner needs to be rebuilt properly," she said. "Not patched, rebuilt. Larger stones, set deeper, with clay packing behind rather than just at the joints." She turned a page. "The middle section check stones. 2 shifted, the rest held. The ones that shifted need to be repositioned and pinned with longer stakes." "You made notes," Caleb said. "During the flood." "I made notes after the flood started easing off." "In the rain. The pencil still works wet." She looked at him. He was staring at her. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Nothing at all." Thomas Dutton walked past them toward the barn, carrying a length of rope that needed to be recoiled, and he looked at the channel and then at Caleb and said, with the flat certainty of a 15-year-old who had not yet learned to hedge his statements, "It didn't break." No, Caleb said. It didn't. My dad said it would. Thomas seemed to be working something out. He didn't say it mean. He said it like he thought it was the truth. What does he say now, you think? Thomas considered this seriously, the way he did everything. I don't know. I'll ask him. He went into the barn. Caleb looked at Elena. She looked at him. He'll tell his father it held, she said quietly. I know. And Walt Dutton will tell someone. I know that too. She closed the ledger. Around them, the surviving members of the work crew were moving through the aftermath, checking sections, cataloging damage, moving with the exhausted purposefulness of people who were tired but not beaten. Dermot was already at the trough section with a candle, assessing the broken boards. Henry Briggs had found the shovel and was clearing debris from the channel intake. The field below them was soaked, genuinely, thoroughly soaked for the first time since spring. The cracked earth had taken the storm water and the irrigation water both and was holding them, and in the last orange light of the evening, Caleb could swear he could almost see the difference already, the slight darkening of the soil that meant it had water in it down past the surface. He probably couldn't see that. It was probably his imagination. He decided not to examine the question too closely. Agnes Thorne arrived at dusk, her horse picking its careful way down the track in the fading light. She'd ridden over when she saw the storm moving toward the basin, she said, but the roads had been bad, and she'd arrived late. She walked the channel without comment, the way Vera Solt had done that first day, checking everything with her hands and her eyes. She came back and stood with Elena near the collection pool. What's the damage count? She said. Repairable, Elena said. 2 days, maybe 3. Then it's not damage, Agnes said. It's just work. Elena looked at her. That's an optimistic way to see it. I'm not an optimistic person, Agnes said. I'm a practical one. There's a difference. She looked out at the soaked field. This ground is going to be soft for a week. Good for planting. I was thinking the same thing. You'll want to get seed in fast before it dries back out. I've got winter wheat seed I was saving, more than I need for my own ground. She said it the way she said most things, as a statement of fact, not an offer, even though it was clearly both. Agnes, it's seed. It'll keep better in the ground than in a sack. She turned to go back to her horse. I'll bring it tomorrow. Thank you, Elena said. Agnes paused, her back still to them. Don't thank me, she said. Just plant it deep. The ground gets hard again fast once it dries, and I don't want to watch good seed go to waste. She rode away in the near dark, the sound of her horse fading into the silence the storm had left behind. Elena stood looking after her for a moment. I like her, she said. I know you do, Caleb said. You have the same way of giving compliments. Elena turned to look at him. What does that mean? It means you both do it like it's accidentally happening. He was already walking toward the barn. Come on. I want to check on the goats. She followed him, her boots squelching in the wet ground. The goats were fine, rattled by the thunder, crowded into the back corner of the pen, but fine. Pepper came to the gate when Caleb approached and pressed her nose against his hand the way she'd pressed it against the crack in the cliff face, and he scratched behind her ears and felt, despite everything, despite the storm damage and the repair work ahead and the $15 they'd spent on Harlow's easement and the winter that was coming eventually behind the summer, a specific and uncomplicated gratitude for how the last few weeks had gone. Not perfectly, not smoothly, not the way anyone had planned or hoped, but the water was running and the ground was soaked, and tomorrow Agnes Thorne would bring winter wheat seed, and Dermot Canty would fix the trough boards, and Thomas Dutton would ask his father what he thought now. And the spring, deep in its sandstone cavern, would keep flowing, indifferent to floods and easements and the plans of the people who had built their lives around it, steady and quiet and completely, impossibly real. Agnes brought the wheat seed the next morning in 2 burlap sacks loaded across her mule's back, and she brought something else with her that nobody had asked for. Vera Solt, sitting straight-backed on the wagon seat beside her, holding a covered pot that turned out to contain a beef stew that fed 8 people for lunch and left enough for dinner besides. Nobody asked how Vera had gotten a beef stew together in the aftermath of a flash flood. Some things you accepted without investigation. The repair work took 2.5 days. Dermot's estimate of 1 day for the trough had been optimistic. The broken boards needed to be cut to fit, not just replaced from scrap, and the second board split along the grain when they were setting it, which cost them another half day of cutting and fitting and muttering. But by the afternoon of the third day following the storm, the water was running clean through every section of the system. The northwest corner of the collection pool was rebuilt with larger stones set 18 inches deep, and Agnes Thorne's winter wheat was in the ground. Caleb stood at the field's edge and watched the water move through the collection channels into the soft, dark soil, and he thought about the woman on the wagon he'd seen going the other direction 3 years ago on the road into the basin. He'd wondered about her since the beginning of all this, whether she'd been right to leave, whether the look on her face had been grief or relief. He didn't wonder anymore. He understood now that it was both at once, and that both were legitimate, and that the fact he was still here didn't make her wrong, and the fact she was gone didn't make him right. They had just made different bets on the same uncertain country. His bet was looking better this week than it had in a while. The wheat seed went in, and then the real business of autumn began. The kind of sustained, grinding work that had no drama in it, just necessity. The goat herd needed to be rebuilt. They had 9, which was not enough, and the first thing was finding breeding stock before winter. Elena wrote letters. She had a methodical approach to correspondence that Caleb had always found impressive. She kept a list of who she'd written, when, what she'd asked, what she expected in return, and she followed up with the precision of someone running a business, which he supposed was what they were doing. She got 2 responses in the first week of September. One from a stock dealer in Prescott who had dairy goats available at prices that made Caleb wince. One from a family in the northern part of the territory who were downsizing their herd and willing to part with 4 breeding does, and a young buck for what amounted to half what the Prescott dealer was asking. "We go north," Elena said, holding both letters at the breakfast table. "That's 60 miles. I know how far it is. We take the wagon. We're there and back in 5 days." She set the letters down. "Henry can watch the system while we're gone. Dermot knows enough to handle minor issues. It's September. There's a lot to do before Caleb." She looked at him with the particular patience she deployed when she thought he was manufacturing obstacles. "We need the goats. We need them before winter. This is the best option we have." He looked out the window. The field was green. Not lush, not the way Kansas was green, but actually genuinely green, with the winter wheat pushing up in thin rows through the dark soil. The sight of it still did something strange to him every morning. "All right," he said, "we leave Thursday." They left Thursday. Henry Briggs took the morning shift on the channel system with the calm competence of a man who had been paying close attention for 2 months, and Vera Solt had produced from somewhere a maintenance schedule written in her schoolteacher hand that she pressed into Henry's keeping with the instruction that if anything departed from it, she expected to be notified immediately. The road north was rough and took them through country that made Redhorn Basin look hospitable by comparison. Flat stretches of alkali flats, canyon passages where the wagon clearance made Caleb's shoulders tense, 2 creek crossings that had water in them, surprisingly, from the recent storms. Elena spent most of the travel time with her ledger in her lap, working on something. When he asked what, she said land surveys. "Whose land surveys?" "The abandoned claims. The ones Harlow holds debt notes on." She turned a page. "I've been thinking about his amendment to the easement agreement, the one about renegotiating terms for any system expansion." "You've been thinking about it since you signed it." "I've been thinking about it since he proposed it," she corrected. "The thing is, those abandoned claims represent usable acreage. Good acreage, some of it. If the water system extends far enough, that land becomes viable again, which means it becomes valuable again, which means Harlow will try to sell it, or develop it, or leverage it." She looked up from the ledger. "He's not going to sit on 5 or 6 abandoned homesteads indefinitely. He bought those debt notes because he saw an opportunity. He just didn't know exactly what the opportunity was when he bought them." Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching the road. The mules moved at their steady and different pace. "And now he does," he said. "Now he does." She closed the ledger. "I don't know what he'll do with it. I'm just not going to be surprised." The family in the north, the Becketts, an older couple whose grown children had moved east and taken the grandchildren with them, had a good operation, clean and well-maintained, and the 4 they parted with were healthy animals in good condition. The young buck was ugly, which Elena noted and the Becketts confirmed cheerfully, But he was sound, and he had good lines, and ugly goats made just as much milk as pretty ones. They spent one night in the Beckett's barn, slept on actual straw that didn't smell of creek water, and Elena had a 2-hour conversation with Mrs. Beckett after dinner about root cellaring techniques that produced, the next morning, a written list of preservation methods that Elena copied into her ledger with the focused attention she gave to anything practically useful. They drove back south with 4 does and an ugly buck in the wagon bed, and the animals were aggrieved about it in the specific way goats always were, loudly and with great personal feeling. And by the time they reached the basin, Caleb's left ear felt like it had been used for something other than hearing. The basin looked different when they came back into it. He didn't know if it was the absence of a few days giving him fresh eyes, or if it had actually changed, but it looked, not flourishing, that was too strong, but less defeated than it had been. The fields they passed on the approach to their own claim were showing green. The Pellegrini brothers' place had a new structure going up, a small shed or storage building, which meant they were planning ahead rather than just enduring. The channel lines were visible from the road, running north to south through the terrain like careful handwriting in the red earth. Henry was waiting at the Ashford place when they drove in. He took the mule reins without being asked, which told Caleb something had happened. "What is it?" Elena said. "2 families came in yesterday," Henry said, "from the south end of the basin. They'd been trying to hold on without water access. Smaller operations, no established claim near any of the channel routes. The woman of one family, her name's Clara Webb, she came to find me when she heard the system was working. She has a sick child." "How sick?" Elena said immediately. "Fever. Her husband thinks it might be from the water they've been drinking. Their well went bad in August. They've been using runoff from the canyon floor." He paused. "She asked me if she could bring the boy here, to get clean water." Caleb had already jumped down from the wagon. "Where is she?" "I put them in the Pellegrini bunkhouse for now. Marco offered it." "Get them here," Elena said. She was already moving toward the house. Clara Webb was a small, exhausted woman in her early 30s who had the look of someone who had been running on determination for so long that she'd forgotten what rest felt like. Her son, a boy of about 7 named Will, was feverish and pale and lay in the back of their wagon wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days. Her husband Nate stood beside the wagon with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had run out of options and knew it. Elena brought water, clean water from the spring carried up that morning, and Ruth Dutton arrived 20 minutes later with the competent, no-nonsense energy of someone who had managed sick children before and knew the procedure. She took over the boy's care with quiet efficiency, and within an hour Will Webb was inside the Ashford house on a pallet near the window with a cool cloth on his forehead and clean water to sip. And Clara Webb was sitting at the kitchen table crying in a quiet, private way that she was clearly embarrassed about. Elena sat with her. She didn't say much. She poured coffee and pushed it across the table and let the woman cry, which was the right thing to do and was harder than it looked, because Elena's instinct was always to solve and fix and plan, and sometimes the thing that needed to happen had no solution except presence. Caleb stood on the porch with Nate Webb, who was a lean, sunburned man of about 35 with a specific kind of quiet that came from too much worry sustained over too long. "I'm sorry to show up like this," Nate said. "Don't be," Caleb said. "We've been trying to manage on our own since June. I kept thinking it would turn." He looked at the channel lines running through the field. "I should have come earlier." "You're here now." Nate was quiet for a moment. "What does it cost?" "To connect to the water system?" "Labor," Caleb said. "Your share of maintenance work. We have an agreement. I'll get you a copy." "No money fee?" "No money fee." Nate turned his hat in his hands. "The other family that came in, the Garcias, Luis and his wife Marta, they've got a claim about half a mile east of ours. Same situation. Well, went bad. No water access. Luis asked me to ask for him too." "Both of you come to the next meeting," Caleb said. "Bring whatever you know about your land grades and distances. Elena will want to look at the routing." The boy Will's fever broke 2 days later. He was up and moving around the Ashford yard by the end of the week, a thin, large-eyed child who followed Pepper the goat with the intense devotion that children reserved for animals who tolerated them. Pepper, characteristically, tolerated him completely. Clara Webb watched them from the porch with an expression that had no adequate word for it. The particular look of a mother watching her child be well when he might not have been. It was Agnes Thorne who first raised the question of the second family, the Garcias, at the following week's community meeting. The meetings had become a regular thing now. Every Tuesday, rotating location, whoever could come came. They had grown from the original 7 families to 9 with the addition of the Webbs and the Garcias, and the meetings had taken on the slightly chaotic quality of any gathering where 9 different households with 9 different problems were trying to coordinate. The Garcia property is southeast, Agnes said, spreading her hand-drawn map on the table. The grade is workable, Mal. I walked it myself, but the channel run would cross Harlow's eastern parcel. The room went quiet in the way it always did when Harlow's name came up. How much of his parcel? Elena asked. 40 feet, maybe 50. That's within the original easement scope, Elena said. The agreement covers the planned routes, and the eastern expansion was in the original proposal. Harlow might not see it that way, Henry said. Harlow will see it exactly that way, Elena said, which is why I'm going to go talk to him before we start digging. She looked around the table. I'll go this week. I want Vera to come with me. Vera Solt looked up from her notebook. Why me? Because you drafted the agreement, and you know every word of it, and because Harlow is a man who responds to people who know exactly what they're talking about. Vera considered this. All right, she said. They rode to Cutter's Ford on Wednesday. Harlow was behind his counter again, same smile, same neat mustache, same professional pleasantness. He had, Caleb had heard, expanded his store in the past month, added a line of agricultural supplies and seeds that he'd not carried before. Word had apparently reached him that the basin was getting its water situation sorted out, and he was positioning accordingly. Elena let Vera lead the conversation, which was the right call. Vera Solt in a business discussion was something to observe. She spoke with the precision of someone who had spent decades teaching young people that imprecise language was the root of most problems, and she had the ability to quote verbatim from a document she'd read months ago, which visibly unsettled Harlow in the best possible way. Section 4, paragraph 2, Vera said, holding her copy of the agreement. The planned route, as described in the attached survey sketch, which includes the eastern corridor to the property boundary. The Garcia connection falls within that description. Harlow smiled. The survey sketch was somewhat general in its scope. The survey sketch uses specific compass bearings and distance measurements, Vera said. I drew it myself. I know what it says. A pause. Harlow looked at Elena, who was sitting with her hands folded and her expression completely neutral. You're adding 2 new families to the system, Harlow said. That increases the water draw. More draw on the system means more value on the land the system runs through. More value on the land the system serves, Elena said, including the abandoned claims you're holding, which are, as I understand it, also served by the current channel routes. She held his gaze. You've been benefiting from the increased land values since August, Mr. Harlow. That benefit continues with the expansion. Another pause, longer this time. I'll sign the extension, Harlow said. Same terms. Good, Elena said. She stood. I'll have the documentation to you by end of week. They were outside and walking to their horses before Vera spoke. He's going to try something eventually, the older woman said. I know, Elena said. Not something obvious, something legal, something technical. Vera paused. I've seen this kind of man before. Back in Ohio. They don't move until they think they have a position they can defend. I know that too, Elena said, which is why every agreement we make with him is documented and witnessed and filed with the land office. She mounted her horse. He'll keep finding ways to make himself useful, because as long as he's useful, we can't cut him out. But eventually, useful becomes control. That depends on how we build the system, Elena said. If no single property holds decisive leverage, including ours, then nobody controls it. Not us, not Harlow, not anyone. Vera looked at her for a moment. You've been thinking about this a long time. Since before we finished the first channel, Elena said. They rode back toward the basin in the early afternoon light, the mountains throwing long shadows across the desert floor, the sky going from white blue to the deeper, clearer blue that September brought when the monsoon season finally finished with its business. Behind them, Cutter's Ford receded into the flat distance. Ahead of them, the Redhorn Basin sat in its bowl of red stone, the channel lines running through it like veins, green things growing along their edges in the places where the water had been working for weeks. It didn't look like victory, it didn't look like security or permanence, or any of the things you might want a place to look like after everything they'd put into it. It looked like a place where something had been started, where the ground was showing its first tentative agreement to be worked, where people who had been holding on alone had begun, slowly and imperfectly, and with significant argument along the way, to hold on together. That night, Caleb sat on the porch after Elena had gone inside, just long enough to look at the sky. The stars were out in the way they got in September, sharp and close, the kind of sky that made you feel small in a way that was more clarifying than frightening. The goats were settled. The field was dark, but the water was running through the channel. He could hear it, the faint, constant sound that had become the baseline of his daily life over the past 2 months. He thought about Nate Webb, turning his hat in his hands and apologizing for arriving at the end of his rope. He thought about Marco Pellegrini sitting down in the dirt when the water came through, about Thomas Dutton carrying rocks in a flash flood, and Agnes Thorne arriving at dusk with seed wheat she'd been saving, and Vera Solt with her schoolteacher's notebook full of easement terms and meeting minutes and maintenance schedules. None of it had been his plan. None of it had gone the way he'd expected when Pepper the goat had pressed her nose against a crack in the cliff face on an afternoon in July that felt about 10 years ago now. The spring didn't care about any of that. It had been flowing for longer than any of them had been alive, and it would flow long after they were gone, and it had no opinion about the people who had built their lives around its water, or the arguments they'd had, or the deals they'd made, or the flood it had survived. But they were still here. That was the thing, in the end. After all of it, the drought and the dying goats and the $15 and Harlow's smile and the flash flood and the fever and the easement arguments, they were still here, and so were 9 families who might not have been. He sat with that for a while. Then he went inside. The trouble with Harlow came in October, the way Elena had said it would. Not obvious, not loud, but technical and carefully timed. It arrived in the form of a letter from a land attorney in Tucson named Gideon Marsh, delivered to the Ashford place on a Tuesday morning by a writer who didn't wait for a response. The letter was 3 pages, written in the dense, folded language that attorneys used when they wanted to say something specific while leaving themselves room to mean something else. Caleb read it twice and understood about half of it. He handed it to Elena, who read it once, set it on the table, and sat looking at the window for a long moment. "What does it say?" Caleb said. Not a question, a request for her translation. It says that Everett Harlow, as holder of debt notes on 5 abandoned claims within the basin, has filed a petition with the Territorial Land Office to have those claims formally consolidated under a single land grant. She paused. Under his name. Can he do that? Apparently the Territorial Code has a provision for it when abandoned claims have been held in debt for more than 18 months without the original homesteaders filing for extension. She tapped the letter. 3 of the 5 claims have been in that status since spring. The other 2 cross into it in November. Caleb looked at the letter. And the easement agreement? The easement agreement is with Harlow as a private individual holding debt notes. If the land consolidates under a formal grant, the legal status of the easement changes. Marsh is arguing that the original agreement doesn't transfer automatically to a new grant structure. She picked up the letter again. It might hold up in a territorial court. It might not. But even if we fight it and win, the legal process takes months, and in the meantime, Harlow's attorney can argue that continued construction on disputed easement land constitutes trespass. Which stops everything, Caleb said. Which stops everything, she said. The meeting that week had 12 people in it. The original 9 families plus 3 more who had come in from the outer edges of the basin after hearing about the water system and making inquiries. A family called the Okafor family, originally from Nigeria by way of New Orleans, who had filed on a claim 18 months ago and held it through everything with a stubbornness that made even Agnes Thorne nod with approval when she heard about it. A widow named Bernadette Houle, who had been running her late husband's cattle operation alone for 2 years, and a young man named Pete Sorrells, who wasn't yet 25, and had shown up with nothing but a land claim and a mule, and somehow still had both. Caleb read the letter aloud. When he finished, the room had the specific quality of silence that followed bad news. Not shocked, Because most of these people had been receiving bad news for long enough that shock had worn off, but focused, the way people get when they've decided to think rather than react. Vera Solt spoke first. The key issue is the timing of the petition. Harlow filed before the November deadline, which means the two borderline claims come under the same filing. He moved deliberately. He's been planning this since the easement agreement, Agnes said. Since before that, Elena said. Since he saw what we were building, he's been waiting for the legal threshold to align. So what do we do? Marco Pellegrini asked. There are two options, Elena said. We contest the consolidation petition with the land office. That's a legal fight. It costs money we don't have, and it takes time we can't afford. She looked around the room. Or we remove the ground from under the petition before it can be processed. How? Henry said. The original homesteaders who abandoned those claims, if they formally file for claim extension before the petition is finalized, the consolidation can't proceed. The debt notes remain, but Harlow can't consolidate land that has active extension filings. Those people left, Nate Webb said. Some of them are halfway across the country. I know where 3 of them went, Vera said quietly. Everyone looked at her. I've been corresponding with families who left the basin since August, keeping records. She opened her notebook. The Kellers went to Albuquerque. The Dunns are in Santa Fe. The Harmon family, whose barn timber you used, they're in Flagstaff, as you know. Those 3 claims are among the 5 Harlow filed on. The room was very quiet. You've been corresponding with them, Elena said. I'm a school teacher, Vera said. I write letters. It's what I do. She turned a page. I can write to all 3 within the week. If they're willing to file extensions, we need them to contact the Territorial Land Office directly. The filing fee is small. I believe we can cover it collectively if needed. What about the other 2 claims? Caleb asked. The other 2 belong to a single family, Vera said. The Beaumont family. A man, his wife, and 2 daughters. They went east. I don't have an address. She paused. But the Beaumonts owed a debt to Dermot Canty before they left. 3 months' wages for work Dermot did on their barn. Everyone looked at Dermot. Dermot scratched the back of his neck. They said they'd send it when they settled somewhere. Never did. He thought about it. I might have an address from an old letter, back at my place. Get it tonight, Elena said. Dermot got it that night. The address was 18 months old and possibly no longer current, but Vera wrote the letter anyway, explaining the situation with the careful clarity she brought to all her correspondence, and sent it by the fastest mail route available. Then they waited, which was the hard part. The Territorial Land Office had a processing window of 30 days on consolidation petitions. Harlow's filing had come in on October 3rd. They had until November 3rd. It was now October 14th. Caleb had never been good at waiting. He managed it the same way he managed most things that were bad for him, by keeping his body busy while his mind did what it wanted. He and Tomas Pellegrini spent the waiting period extending the Eastern Channel Spur to the Garcia property, which was straightforward work on good ground, and the physical rhythm of it, dig, set stone, check grade, advance, was useful in the way that physical labor was always useful when there was nothing to be done about the thing you were actually worried about. Elena was less able to compartmentalize. He'd find her at the table late at night with the land office regulations she'd gotten from Vera, reading sections he knew she'd already read, working through the arguments they'd make if the extension filings didn't come through in time. She wasn't sleeping well. He could tell by the way she moved in the mornings, not slow, Elena was never slow, but careful, the way people moved when they were tired and trying not to show it. Come to bed, he said one night, coming in at 11 to find her still at the table. In a minute. You said that an hour ago. She looked up. The lamp was burning low. If Vera can't reach the Beaumonts, or if they won't file, then we deal with that when it happens. I'd rather think it through now so we're not improvising under pressure. You've thought it through 6 times already. You told me the options this morning. You told me again after dinner. He sat down across from her. Elena, you know the options. You'll know them just as well tomorrow morning after you've slept. She looked at him for a moment. The lamplight made her look tired in a way she wouldn't have wanted him to see in daylight, which meant she was more worried than she was letting on even to herself. What if we lose the easements, she said. Her voice was quiet, the flatness gone out of it. What if Harlow wins this and we have to reroute everything? The Pellegrini line, the Weber spur, all of it. And people lose water access over the winter. Then we reroute, he said. It'll be harder and take longer and cost more. But we built the first one from nothing, Elena. We'll build the second one from what we know. She looked at him. You're very calm about this. I'm not calm, he said. I'm tired and I'm scared and I trust you to have already thought of everything that can be thought of. Which you have. So now it's time to sleep. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she closed the regulations document and pushed it to the side of the table. One more thing, she said. There's always one more thing. If we win this, if the extension filings come through and Harlow's petition fails, we need to move immediately on the eastern expansion. All of it. Everything we've planned for spring, we push it to late fall before the ground gets too hard. That's a brutal work schedule. I know. But if we wait until spring, Harlow has the winter to find another angle. If we're built out fully before he can reposition, his leverage drops. She paused. He's not going to stop. Men like him don't stop. They recalibrate. Caleb thought about Vera's assessment of Harlow back in September. He'll keep finding ways to make himself useful. Because as long as he's useful, we can't cut him out. If we build out fully, he said, every family in the basin has water access. Nobody needs Harlow's easements for anything new. His abandoned claims become just land with channels running through them. He looked at her. Is that what you're working toward? His leverage depends on the channels needing his land, Elena said simply. If the system is complete, they don't. He sat with that for a moment. It was not the most comfortable thought. It had the shape of something that could be called maneuvering or strategy, or being no different than the man they were trying to outmaneuver. He knew Elena had been sitting with the same discomfort because she hadn't said it plainly until now. He started it, he said. That's true, she said. It's also not really the point. The point is whether what we're doing is right, independent of what he's doing. She folded her hands. And I think it is, because we're not trying to take anything from him. We're trying to make sure he can't take anything from us, or from the Pellegrinis, or the Webbs, or the Garcias. There's a difference, he said. There is, she agreed. I just want to be sure we know it. He reached across the table and covered her folded hands with one of his. Come to bed, he said. The difference will still be there in the morning. This time she came. The first response arrived on October 21st. The Kellers, from Albuquerque, wrote back to Vera within a week of her letter reaching them. They would file for extension. They didn't want the land back, they wrote, but they didn't want Harlow to have it either. They included a postal money order for the filing fee. The Dunns replied 4 days later. Same answer. Same reasoning. Martha Dunn added a postscript in different handwriting, her husband's, Vera guessed, that said simply, we should have stayed. Tell the Ashfords we're sorry we didn't. The Harmon reply came on October 27th, and Mrs. Harmon, whose barn timber was currently supporting a water trough over a volcanic shelf in the Red Horn Basin, wrote a letter of such warmth and precision that Vera read it aloud at the Tuesday meeting. And Agnes Thorne, who was not a woman who showed emotion in public, looked at the wall for a moment before she looked back. 3 claims covered. The Beaumont letter had gone unanswered. October 31st. 2 days left. Caleb was in the field checking the eastern spur channel when he heard a horse coming fast up the track from the south. He straightened up and watched it come. The rider was Dermot Canty, pushing his horse harder than Dermot usually pushed anything. Dermot pulled up, breathing hard himself from the urgency of it, even though he wasn't the one who'd been running. Vera got a telegram, he said, from the Beaumonts. They're in Kansas. The husband is sick. He can't travel, but... Dermot caught his breath. His wife, Cora Beaumont, she wired back that she'll file by telegraph authorization if the land office accepts it. Vera's already writing the inquiry to the land office to confirm the procedure. Caleb stood in the field for a moment. Does it work? He said. Telegraph authorization for a land filing? Vera thinks it might. The territorial code has a provision for remote filings in extenuating circumstances. She's citing the husband's illness. When will they decide? Vera sent the inquiry this morning. She's hoping for a response tomorrow. Dermot paused. November 2nd. 1 day before Harlow's petition finalized. The response from the Territorial Land Office came the next morning. November 2nd, as Dermot had said, and it was Vera Solt who rode to the Ashford place with it, arriving before breakfast with her back straight and her notebook in her saddlebag, and her expression revealing nothing until she was off the horse and standing in front of them. The Land Office accepts telegraph authorization for remote filings under extenuating circumstances Clause 7 of the Territorial Code, she said. Cora Beaumont filed by telegraph at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. She paused, and something moved across her usually controlled face, not quite a smile, but the near vicinity of one. Harlow's consolidation petition failed for incomplete qualifying claims. Elena closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and said, "When did you hear?" "An hour ago. I came directly." "Does Harlow know?" The Land Office would have notified his attorney this morning. Caleb looked out at the field. The eastern spur was half finished. The winter wheat was coming in thin but real. The goats, 12 now, with the 4 they'd brought back from the Becketts, the ugly buck having proved his value promptly and without ceremony, were moving in the pen below the barn. "All right," he said. "We need to get word to the other families, and then we need to build." They built through November and into the first weeks of December, pushing harder than was probably wise, harder than their bodies wanted, in the short days before the ground froze solid enough to make digging impractical. Every family contributed: labor, materials, tools, the particular knowledge each person had accumulated from their own circumstances. Okafor, who had an engineering background from his time in New Orleans, redesigned 2 sections of the eastern expansion with a revised grade calculation that increased flow efficiency and saved them 3 days of digging. Bernadette Houle had timber from a structure she'd been meaning to pull down for 2 years, and she pulled it down and hauled it over in her wagon and didn't ask for anything in return except a place in the system. Pete Sorrells, 24 years old and apparently made of something tougher than ordinary people, worked 12-hour days 6 days a week and seemed fine about it. Everett Harlow came to see them in mid-November. Not with his attorney, alone, riding into the Ashford property on a Wednesday afternoon and tying his horse at the fence post with the careful movements of a man who was aware he was on ground where he wasn't entirely welcome. Elena came off the porch to meet him. Caleb stayed where he was, at the channel, within earshot. Harlow looked older somehow than he had the last time she'd seen him, though it had only been a few weeks. The professional pleasantness was still there, but it sat differently on his face, like a coat he'd been wearing too long. "I want you to know I don't have any hard feelings," he said. Elena looked at him. "All right." "The petition was a legitimate legal option. I was protecting my investment." "I understand that," she said. "We were protecting ours." A pause. "The Land Office has informed me that with 4 of the 5 claims now under extension filings, the value of my debt notes decreases substantially." He looked past her at the field, at the channels, at the green things growing along the water lines. "I'd like to discuss selling the notes." "To whom?" "To the original homesteaders, if they're willing. Or to the community association, if there is one." He paused. "I understand there may be one forming." Elena was quiet for a moment. There was, in fact, a community association forming. Vera had drafted the articles of organization 2 weeks ago, and the meeting to ratify them was scheduled for Thursday. But she hadn't publicized it outside the Basin families. "How did you hear about that?" she said. Harlow allowed himself a small, honest expression that was the closest she'd ever seen him come to candor. "I pay attention," he said. "Same as you." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had tried to box them in, who had planned and maneuvered and timed his moves, who had also, when the timing worked against him, come back without his lawyer to talk straight. "Bring a price to the Thursday meeting," she said. "We'll hear it." He nodded. He seemed like he was going to say something else, and then didn't, and went back to his horse and rode out the way he'd come. Caleb walked up from the channel. "A price." "A fair one, probably," Elena said. "He's a businessman. He knows the notes are worth less now, and fighting us through the courts would cost more than selling. He'll offer a fair price because it's the practical thing to do." "Do you trust him?" She thought about it honestly. "No, but I don't need to trust him. I need to make sure any agreement we make with him is structured so that trust isn't required." She paused. "Vera can handle that." Vera handled it. The Thursday meeting ratified the Community Association articles, voted in Vera Solt as the first secretary because everyone agreed she was the obvious choice, and she was the only one who didn't want the job, which was also an obvious qualification. Harlow attended, presented his price for the 5 debt notes, and Vera negotiated him down 11% without raising her voice or changing her expression once, which Dermot Canty would describe at length to people for years afterward. The notes transferred to the Community Association in December. The land reverted to a managed commons, not owned by any single family, available for use by any basin resident, the channel infrastructure running through it protected by the association agreement. Harlow rode back to Cutter's Ford and expanded his agricultural supply inventory because the basin was growing now, and growing people needed seeds and tools. He made money. He was never a friend. He was a fact of life in the territory, and facts of life could be managed. December came hard and cold, the way Arizona winters did. Not the deep snows of northern country, but a sustained, biting cold that made the mornings difficult and the evenings long. The channel system required winter adaptations. Insulation over the vulnerable sections, reduced flow rates through the coldest weeks to prevent ice buildup at joints. Elena managed the adjustments with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and the system ran through the winter with only 2 stoppages, both brief, both repaired before they cost anyone more than a day's inconvenience. The winter wheat that Agnes had brought came up in January, thin and green and completely real, the color of something alive in the brown and gray of the desert winter. Caleb stood at the field's edge one morning and looked at it for a long time, the way he'd looked at the water in the channel on that first day, with the feeling that his eyes weren't quite conveying what was actually in front of them. Elena came up beside him. She was carrying her coffee and her ledger, as she almost always was. "The stand is thin in the northeast corner," she said. "I know. We'll overseed in the spring." "I know." She looked at him. "Why are you standing here staring at it?" He thought about how to answer that. "When we were almost out of water," he said. "When the well was down to 4 feet and the tansy doe died and you came out and said we needed to talk about leaving. What were you thinking?" She was quiet for a moment. "That I was probably right," she said, "about leaving. That the practical, rational thing was to cut our losses and go." "But you didn't want to." "I didn't want to. But wanting isn't always a good guide." She sipped her coffee. "What I actually thought was, we had enough left to try one more thing. Just one. And if it didn't work, then we'd know we'd genuinely run out of options, and leaving wouldn't feel like quitting. It would feel like the truth. And then Pepper found the crack in the cliff. She looked at the wheat, which I'm choosing not to analyze too much." He laughed. She almost smiled. "The thing is," he said after a moment, "I've been thinking about why it worked. Not the channel system. The engineering of it, that was you. But why the whole thing worked. The Pellegrinis staying, Agnes and Vera and Dermot and the Duttons, the Beaumonts filing from Kansas, all of it. Why do you think it worked?" He considered it carefully because it felt like something he should get right. "Because we asked for help," he said, "not for charity. We asked people to work and told them what they'd get for it, and treated the agreement like it mattered. And they did the same." He paused. "We didn't try to do it alone. That was the part I almost got wrong." Elena was quiet for a while. The sun was coming up fully now, clearing the eastern rock formations, throwing long slanted light across the field, and turning the wheat's thin rows to gold. "I almost got something wrong too," she said. "What?" "The Harlow thing. I was so focused on making sure he couldn't use us that I almost forgot the point wasn't to beat him. The point was to make something that worked regardless of what he did." She looked at her coffee. "There's a difference between building something strong and building something defensive. I had to keep reminding myself." He thought about that. It was true. And it was the kind of thing that was easy to lose track of when someone was actively maneuvering against you. "Did you keep it straight?" he said. "Mostly." She turned a page in her ledger. "The community association structure. That was me keeping it straight. Nobody controls the water. Not us, not Harlow, not any one family. It's held in common. That was the thing I needed to get right more than anything else." He looked at the field, at the channels running through it, at the line of green that shouldn't exist in this desert in January, and did anyway. He thought about Pepper pressing her nose against the cliff face, about the cool air coming out of the dark, about Elena's hand finding his in the cavern, pulling him to his feet, in the beginning of all of this when they still didn't know what any of it would become. He thought about what Vera had told him once, at a meeting, almost in passing, that the greatest systems human beings built were never the ones that made one person powerful. They were the ones that made power unnecessary, because everyone had what they needed. He hadn't fully understood it then. He understood it now, standing in a field in January in the Arizona territory, watching wheat grow in ground that had been cracked and dead in July. Nobody controlled the spring. You couldn't control it. It came from somewhere deep in the rock, from processes that had nothing to do with human plans or human ambition, and it would keep flowing after everyone who'd built channels around it was gone. What you could control, what you were responsible for, was what you chose to do with the water once you found it. You could keep it for yourself. That was a choice. It would have been a defensible choice. They had the legal standing, the claim, the precedent. They could have built a fence around the cave entrance and told the world to sort itself out. They didn't, and the reason they didn't was not complicated. It was not about strategy or leverage or the long game. It was simpler than that and harder to articulate. They had water, and their neighbors didn't, and they were all people in the same hard country, and that was enough. The afternoon the Pellegrini brothers got water, the afternoon Marco sat down in the dirt and covered his face, Caleb hadn't understood yet what he'd done by sharing the spring. He'd thought of it as a practical arrangement, a fair exchange of water for labor, the kind of deal that made sense on a frontier where everyone needed something. He understood it differently now. What he'd done, what Elena had structured into a legal reality, and Vera had documented, and Henry had organized, and Agnes had seeded into the ground, what all of them had done together, was not an arrangement. It was a decision about what kind of people they were going to be in the place where they'd decided to live. That decision held through the drought and the flood and Harlow's maneuvers and the long, cold winter. It would hold through what came next, too, whatever that was. Caleb put his arm around Elena's shoulders. She let him, which was not always a given. She had a limited tolerance for what she called sentimentality, which was her word for any emotion she hadn't scheduled in advance. "What are we doing today?" he said. She opened her ledger. "The northeast corner needs inspection before we overseed it in spring. I want to check the soil depth. The trough section needs a pitch reapplication before the spring water volume increases. And I got a letter from 2 new families asking about the water system. They're east of the Garcia property." "How far east?" "Far enough to need another meeting," she said. "I was thinking Thursday." He looked at the field, at the water running through the channels, at the ugly buck they'd bought from the Becketts standing at his fence, with the aggrieved expression he wore at all hours, at the spring that had started it all, still flowing somewhere in the dark behind the cliff face, steady and indifferent and completely, impossibly real. "Thursday," he said. "All right." She closed the ledger and finished her coffee and went back into the house to write letters, because there were always letters to write and plans to make and problems to think through, and the desert wasn't going to get easier just because they'd found a way to make it livable. But it was livable. They had made it livable. That was the thing that no one was going to take from them. Not drought, not Harlow, not the hard, indifferent country itself. You could lose land. You could lose money and time and years of effort. You could lose the things you built. But the act of building, the fact of having chosen to try when trying, seemed unreasonable. That didn't leave. It stayed in you, and it changed what you thought was possible, and that changed everything that came after. Caleb stood in the field a little longer, alone with the January light and the sound of water moving through stone. Then he went back to work.